The desert sun beats down mercilessly on the crumbling limestone walls of what was once the most magnificent city in the ancient world. Here, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, lies evidence of a scandal so horrific that ancient Egypt tried to erase it from history entirely. The pharaoh responsible was systematically removed from every monument, every inscription, every record that could bear witness to his crimes. His name was chiseled away with such fury that the very stones seemed to scream with the violence of their defacement. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at destruction. What we've uncovered about Akhenaten and the unspeakable acts he committed against his own daughters represents one of history's most disturbing examples of absolute power corrupting absolutely. This isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. This is the story of a man who transformed his own children into instruments of his twisted ambition, sacrificing their innocence and humanity on the altar of his megalomaniacal vision. The horror began innocently enough, as these things often do. In the golden halls of Thebes, where the Nile's life-giving waters reflected the glory of Egyptian civilization, 6 daughters were born to what appeared to be a loving royal couple. Their names rang like poetry through the palace corridors: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenamun, Nefeneferuaten, Tasherit, Nefeneferura, and Setepenre. Each princess carried within her name a blessing, a prayer to the gods for her prosperity and happiness. Their father, who would later become known as Akhenaten, seemed devoted to his family in those early years. Palace walls were decorated with unprecedented scenes of domestic bliss, showing the royal children playing beneath the benevolent rays of the sun god. These images were revolutionary for their time, depicting the pharaoh not as a remote divine figure, but as a loving father who delighted in his daughters' laughter and cherished their innocent games. But something dark was stirring beneath this facade of familial perfection. The young pharaoh's religious obsessions were growing more intense with each passing year. His fixation on the sun disk, the Aten, was transforming from devotion into dangerous fanaticism. He began to see himself not merely as the god's chosen representative, but as the sole conduit through which divine will could be expressed on earth. This theological megalomania would prove catastrophic for his daughters, though they could not have understood the shadow falling across their childhood paradise. While they played their innocent games and received their education in the arts befitting royal princesses, their father was laying the groundwork for a revolution that would ultimately consume their lives in ways too terrible for civilized minds to contemplate. The transformation accelerated when Akhenaten made his fateful decision to abandon Thebes entirely. He would build a new capital, a virgin city dedicated solely to his god, where he could implement his vision without interference from the traditional priesthood. This city, which he called Akhenaten, would become shocking. As construction began on the stage for horrors that even the violence-accustomed ancient world would find this desert metropolis, the royal daughters found themselves at the center of an increasingly disturbing personality cult. Their father's artists were instructed to create images that emphasized the divine nature of the royal family. But these depictions grew stranger and more unsettling as the years progressed. The princesses were shown not as individual children, but as extensions of their father's divine essence, their identities subsumed into his cosmic vision. The move to Akhenaten marked the beginning of their nightmare. Cut off from the stabilizing influence of the traditional court, isolated in a city populated entirely by their father's fanatical followers, the young princesses found themselves trapped in what amounted to a luxurious prison. The palace walls that had once seemed protective now felt suffocating, and the constant religious ceremonies that dominated daily life became an oppressive routine that allowed no escape from their father's increasingly erratic behavior. But the true horror was yet to come. As Akhenaten, his theological innovations grew desperate, the traditional sources Saturn's religious revolution reached its peak. His need to legitime of royal authority had been severed when he rejected the ancient gods. The priesthood that had validated pharaonic power for millennia had been dismissed and scattered. Foreign allies were beginning to question Egypt's stability under this radical ruler. In this crisis of legitimacy, Akhenaten turned to the most disturbing solution imaginable. He would use his own daughters to create a new form of divine kingship, one that concentrated sacred power within his immediate family through means that violated every norm of human decency. What he planned for these innocent young women represented a perversion of both paternal love and royal authority that staggers the imagination. The first signs of what was to come appeared in subtle changes to palace protocol. The eldest daughter, Akhenaten, began appearing in ceremonies typically reserved for the queen. At first, this seemed merely ceremonial, perhaps a way to honor a beloved daughter or prepare her for future marriage to a suitable prince. But as months passed, the nature of her elevated status became increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Palace artists were commissioned to create reliefs showing Akhenaten in positions that left no doubt about her new role. She stood beside her father during religious ceremonies, not as a daughter supporting her parent, but as a wife supporting her husband. The iconography was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Egyptian royal symbolism. This young woman, barely into her teens, was being prepared for a fate that would have horrified even the most jaded courtiers of that decadent age. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish this transformation must have been extraordinary. Akhenaten had spent years conditioning his daughters to see him as more than merely their father. In his theological system, he was the earthly embodiment of divine will, the living representative of the sun god whose word was literally sacred law. To disobey him was not merely rebellion against paternal authority, but blasphemy against the cosmic order itself. This religious conditioning provided the framework for what would follow, but it could not entirely mask the fundamental wrongness of what Akhenaten was planning. The palace servants whispered in horror about the ceremonies they were forced to witness. Foreign diplomats sent increasingly disturbed reports back to their home courts. Even the fanatical followers, who had abandoned everything to follow their pharaoh to his desert capital, began to express private doubts about the direction of his religious revolution. Meanwhile, the other princesses watched in growing terror as their eldest sister's fate became clear. They could see their own futures written in Akhenaten's glazed eyes and mechanical smiles. The loving father who had once delighted in their childhood games had become something monstrous, a creature whose need for theological validation had consumed any remnant of natural human feeling. The tragedy deepened when Queen Nefertiti, the girl's mother and the one person who might have protected them, mysteriously disappeared from the historical record. Whether she died, was exiled, or simply retreated into obscurity to escape the horror of what her husband had become, her absence left the princesses completely vulnerable to their father's increasingly deranged schemes. As Akhenaten's formal elevation to queenship approached, the psychological damage inflicted on the royal family became impossible to hide. Palace physicians were called in to treat various members of the household for what ancient records describe as ailments of the mind and spirit. The youngest princesses, some barely past infancy, began showing signs of severe emotional disturbance that would mark them for the remainder of their tragically short lives. The preparations for the ceremony that would formalize Akhenaten's new status proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur that Akhenaten could muster. Golden ornaments were crafted, precious stones were set into ceremonial regalia, and the finest artists in the kingdom were commissioned to create monuments celebrating this unholy union. But beneath the surface, magnificence lay a rot so profound that it would ultimately destroy not just the individuals involved, but the entire dynasty they represented. The ceremony that would formalize this abomination took place on a day when the desert winds carried whispers of unease throughout the capital. Ancient texts describe preparations that lasted for weeks, with craftsmen working around the clock to create the regalia that would mark Meritaten's transformation from daughter to wife. The irony was not lost on those forced to participate in these preparations. They were creating symbols of sacred marriage for a union that represented the complete corruption of everything those symbols had once meant. The psychological terror inflicted on Meritaten during this period defies comprehension. Imagine being barely 15 years old, having grown up believing your father loved you as any parent should love their child, only to discover that his affection had twisted into something unspeakably dark. The young woman who had once danced freely in palace gardens now moved through the corridors like a ghost, her eyes vacant, her spirit already broken by the weight of what was expected of her. But Akhenaten's perversions did not end with his eldest daughter. As the months passed and it became clear that Meritaten had not immediately produced the male heir he desperately needed, the pharaoh's attention turned to his second daughter, Akhenaten. This young girl, who could not have been more than 13, suddenly found herself thrust into the same nightmare that had consumed her sister. The pattern established with Meritaten repeated itself with horrifying precision. Palace artists were again commissioned to create reliefs showing the new arrangement, their hands trembling as they carved images that violated every principle of decent human behavior. Akhenaten began appearing in ceremonies wearing the regalia of queenship, standing beside her father in poses that made their new relationship unmistakably clear to anyone who witnessed these obscene spectacles. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish these successive transformations reveals the depths of Akhenaten's depravity. He had created an environment where his daughters had no choice but to comply with his demands, where resistance unthinkable. The religious was not merely forbidden, but literally framework he had constructed made questioning his will equivalent to questioning divine authority itself. Contemporary accounts from palace servants, preserved in fragments of papyrus that survived the later attempts at destruction, describe scenes that haunt the imagination. They speak of young women who move through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their personalities fractured by trauma too severe for their minds to process. They describe ceremonies where these broken girls performed their roles as queens with mechanical precision, while their eyes stared into some distant horror that only they could see. The medical consequences of these arrangements soon became apparent in ways that would shock even an age accustomed to the brutalities of absolute power. Palace physicians were summoned repeatedly to treat conditions that the surviving medical papyri describe in euphemistic language, but their meaning is clear enough to modern understanding. These young women were suffering physical trauma that reflected the unnatural nature of their relationships with their father. The tragedy reached its most horrific crescendo when Akhenaten died under circumstances that the court desperately tried to conceal. The official records speak vaguely of illness, but the artistic evidence tells a different story. Reliefs carved in the royal tomb show scenes of mourning around a young woman lying on what appears to be a birthing bed, attended by midwives and accompanied by a wet nurse holding a newborn infant. The implications of this imagery are inescapable and devastating. Akhenaten had died in childbirth, bearing a child whose father was almost certainly Akhenaten himself. The girl who should have been playing with dolls and learning the arts appropriate to a princess had instead died, bringing her father's offspring into a world that would offer that child no hope of normalcy or happiness. The death of Akhenaten sent shockwaves through what remained of the royal court. Even the most fanatical supporters of Akhenaten's religious revolution found themselves questioning a system that could produce such monstrous results. Whispered conversations in palace corridors spoke of divine judgment, of cosmic retribution for violations so profound that they had disrupted the very order of creation. But rather than recognizing the horror of what he had done, Akhenaten responded to his daughter's death with even more desperate measures. His need for male heirs to continue his revolutionary dynasty had become an obsession that consumed whatever remained of his humanity. The surviving daughters watched their sister's funeral preparations with the terrible knowledge that her death had not ended their nightmare, but had only intensified their father's determination to use them for his dynastic purposes. The youngest of the surviving daughters, Akhenaten, now found herself elevated to the position that had cost her sisters their innocence, and in Akhenaten's case, her life. This child, who bore a name meaning, "she lives for the Aten," would indeed live for her father's god in ways that represented the ultimate perversion of religious devotion. Palace records from this period, fragmentary though they are, paint a picture of a court where normal human relationships had completely broken down. Servants were afraid to look directly at the royal family, not out of traditional respect, but because the sight of what these young women had become was too disturbing to bear. Foreign ambassadors sent reports home describing a pharaoh who had clearly lost his mind and a royal household that had descended into a hell of his own making. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire royal household. The remaining daughters, some still children, lived in constant terror of their own futures. They had witnessed what had happened to their older sisters and understood with the terrible clarity that comes to children in extreme situations that similar fates awaited them. The transformation of these innocent children into instruments of their father's theological ambitions represents one of history's most complete examples of familial destruction in service to political power. These were not merely strategic marriages designed to cement alliances or preserve bloodlines, though Akhenaten certainly justified them in such terms. They were acts of systematic abuse that destroyed the fundamental bonds of trust and love that should exist between parent and child. The religious justification that Akhenaten constructed for these abominations reveals the dangerous extremes to which theological fanaticism can lead. In his twisted interpretation of divine will, the concentration of sacred power within his immediate family required the elimination of normal familial boundaries. He convinced himself, and attempted to convince others, that his daughters were willing participants in a cosmic drama that transcended ordinary moral considerations. But the evidence suggests a very different reality. These young women were victims of a sustained campaign of psychological manipulation and physical abuse that began in their earliest childhood and culminated in violations that destroyed their capacity for normal human relationships. The smiling figures depicted in palace reliefs were masks worn by broken souls who had learned that survival depended on perfect compliance with their tormentors' demands. As news of these arrangements began to leak beyond the walls of Akhenaten, the international community reacted with horror and disgust. Egypt's allies began to question their relationships with a kingdom ruled by a pharaoh whose behavior violated the most basic standards of civilized conduct. Enemy kingdoms seized upon these revelations as evidence of divine judgment against Egypt, using them to justify their own aggressive actions against Egyptian territories. The domestic situation was equally unstable. The traditional priesthood, though officially suppressed, maintained networks of influence throughout the kingdom. These priests used stories of Akhenaten's abuses to demonstrate that his religious revolution had brought cosmic disorder upon Egypt. They whispered that the gods themselves were offended by what was happening in the royal palace and would surely bring judgment upon the entire kingdom if these abominations continued. The systematic destruction of his daughters' lives reached new depths of depravity as Akhenaten's desperation for legitimacy consumed what remained of his sanity. The death of Akhenaten had not satisfied his twisted needs, but had instead awakened an even more ravenous hunger for control over his remaining children. The palace walls that had once echoed with innocent laughter now reverberated with the hollow footsteps of young women who moved like phantoms through corridors that had become their prison. Akhenaten, thrust into the role that had destroyed her older sisters, bore the weight of expectations that would have crushed a grown woman, let alone a child barely past her 13th year. The transformation required of her was not merely ceremonial, but demanded a complete reconstruction of her identity. She was expected to abandon every natural instinct, every protective mechanism that her young mind had developed, and surrender herself completely to her father's megalomaniacal vision. The palace physicians who attended to these arrangements left behind records that speak volumes about the horror they witnessed. Their medical papyri, written in the carefully neutral language of professional observation, nonetheless convey the profound disturbance these learned men felt at what they were compelled to facilitate. They describe treating conditions in young women that should never have existed, ailments that spoke to trauma so severe it manifested in physical symptoms that defied conventional understanding. But perhaps most chilling of all was the systematic nature of Akhenaten's psychological conditioning. This was not the impulsive cruelty of a madman, but the calculated manipulation of a predator who understood exactly how to break down the natural barriers that should have protected his children. He had spent years constructing a theological framework that made resistance not merely difficult, but literally inconceivable within the worldview he had imposed upon his household. The religious ceremonies that marked these unholy unions were spectacles of such profound corruption that even the priests who conducted them struggled to maintain their composure. These men, handpicked for their absolute loyalty to Akhenaten's vision, found themselves presiding over rituals that violated every principle of sacred marriage they had been trained to honor. The words of blessing they spoke over these arrangements tasted like ash in their mouths, and several are recorded as having suffered nervous breakdowns in the aftermath of these ceremonies. The artistic record from this period provides perhaps the most disturbing evidence of what was occurring within the royal household. The reliefs and sculptures created to commemorate these relationships show young women whose faces have been drained of all vitality and hope. Where earlier depictions of the royal daughters had captured the joy and spontaneity of childhood, these later works reveal figures who move through their roles with the mechanical precision of the walking dead. The youngest daughters, Neferuaten Tasherit, Neferureh, and Setpenre, watched these developments with the terrible prescience that comes to children who have learned to read the signs of approaching danger. They understood with crystalline clarity that their father's attention would eventually turn to them, and they began displaying symptoms of severe psychological distress that palace records describe with clinical detachment, but which speak to unimaginable terror. Contemporary accounts from foreign diplomats paint a picture of a court where normal human relationships had completely disintegrated. These seasoned observers, men accustomed to the intrigues and excesses of royal households throughout the ancient world, found themselves struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing in Akhenaten. Their dispatches home speak of a pharaoh who had clearly descended into madness and a royal family that had become something monstrous. The international implications of Akhenaten's domestic arrangements extended far beyond mere scandal. Egypt's vassal states, already struggling under the weight of the pharaoh's neglect of military and diplomatic affairs, began to question whether they owed allegiance to a ruler whose behavior had placed him outside the bounds of civilized conduct. Several client kingdoms sent envoys to neighboring powers, exploring the possibility of switching their allegiances to rulers whose personal lives did not violate fundamental human decency. The economic consequences of this domestic chaos were equally severe. The concentration of resources on maintaining Akhenaten and funding the elaborate ceremonies that marked each new arrangement had drained the royal treasury. Traditional trade relationships, many of which involved religious components, were disrupted when foreign partners refused to participate in commercial ventures that might implicate them in Akhenaten's abominations. Meanwhile, the surviving daughters who had not yet been elevated to queenship lived in a state of constant terror. Palace servants reported finding these young girls huddled together in hidden corners of the royal residence, whispering desperate prayers to gods their father had forbidden them to worship. They had learned to recognize the signs that preceded their father's attention, turning to a new victim, and they watched each other with the helpless anguish of prisoners awaiting execution. The psychological damage inflicted during this period would prove irreversible for most of these young women. Even those who eventually escaped their father's immediate control through his death would carry the scars of their trauma for the remainder of their lives. Akhenaten, who would later become the wife of Tutankhamun, never recovered from the psychological devastation of her years as her father's queen. Historical records suggest she struggled with severe depression and anxiety throughout her adult life, unable to form normal relationships or trust in the basic goodness of human nature. The medical evidence from this period reveals the full scope of the physical abuse these young women endured. Palace physicians were regularly summoned to treat injuries that their carefully coded language suggests resulted from sexual violence. These same medical records indicate that several of the princesses suffered from conditions consistent with repeated trauma, their young bodies bearing witness to violations that their minds had learned to suppress in order to survive. The religious justification that Akhenaten constructed for these acts of familial destruction represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of theological manipulation in service to personal depravity. He had created an entire cosmological system that placed himself at the center of divine creation, making his will indistinguishable from that of the gods themselves. Within this framework, his daughters were not independent human beings with their own rights and desires, but rather instruments through which divine will could be expressed on earth. This theological structure provided psychological cover not only for Akhenaten himself, but for the courtiers and servants who were compelled to facilitate his abuses. By framing these violations as religious duties rather than personal crimes, he created a system where resistance became not merely dangerous, but literally blasphemous. Those who might otherwise have found the courage to protect these young women were paralyzed by the fear that opposition to the Pharaoh's will constituted opposition to divine command itself. The artistic propaganda produced during this period reflects the sophisticated nature of this psychological manipulation. Court artists were instructed to create works that depicted these arrangements as joyful celebrations of divine favor rather than the nightmarish reality they actually represented. These pieces, many of which survived the later attempts at historical erasure, provide a chilling glimpse into the mechanisms by which systematic abuse can be reframed as religious devotion. The palace itself became a stage set designed to reinforce these theological justifications. Every room was decorated with imagery that emphasized the divine nature of the royal family and the sacred character of their relationships. The physical environment constantly reinforced the message that what was happening within these walls was not merely acceptable, but actually blessed by the gods themselves. The few courtiers who attempted to raise concerns about these arrangements found themselves quickly marginalized, or worse. Several prominent officials who had served the royal family for decades simply disappeared from the historical record during this period, their fates unknown, but presumably sealed by their inability to remain silent in the face of such systematic horror. This atmosphere of terror ensured that those who remained in the palace understood the price of moral courage. The youngest princesses began showing signs of severe psychological disturbance that manifested in ways their attendants struggled to understand or treat. Palace records describe episodes where these children would retreat into catatonic states for days at a time, their minds apparently seeking refuge in complete withdrawal from a reality too terrible to process. Other accounts speak of violent outbursts where young girls would attack their own reflections in mirrors, as if trying to destroy the images that reminded them of their fate. The educational system that had once prepared these princesses for lives as respected queens and mothers was completely perverted to serve Akhenaten's twisted purposes. Instead of learning the arts of governance and diplomacy that would have prepared them for normal royal marriages, they were subjected to intensive indoctrination designed to break down their psychological resistance to their father's demands. This process involved not only theological instruction, but also systematic isolation from any influences that might encourage independent thought or resistance. The physical transformation of the palace during this period reflected the moral corruption that had consumed its inhabitants. Rooms that had once been decorated with scenes of family happiness were redecorated with imagery that celebrated the new arrangements. Gardens where the princesses had once played were redesigned to include private chambers where their father could conduct his abuses away from prying eyes. As word of these arrangements began to spread beyond the palace walls, the population of Akhenaten itself began to show signs of moral revulsion. Several prominent families quietly abandoned the city, claiming business elsewhere but actually fleeing from association with a regime that had descended into such depravity. The population that remained was increasingly composed of the most fanatical supporters of Akhenaten's vision, individuals whose own psychological instability made them willing participants in or enablers of his crimes. The international diplomatic community watched these developments with growing horror and disgust. Ambassadors who had once competed for access to the Egyptian court now found excuses to avoid traveling to Akhenaten, unwilling to be associated with what was transpiring there. Several foreign kingdoms began exploring military alliances directed against Egypt, justifying their actions as necessary measures to contain a ruler who had clearly lost all moral restraint. The economic isolation that resulted from this diplomatic ostracism further destabilized Akhenaten's kingdom. Trade relationships that had flourished for centuries began to collapse as foreign merchants refused to do business with a regime that had become synonymous with moral corruption. The wealth that had once flowed into Egypt from international commerce began to dry up, creating additional pressures that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's collapse. The collapse came not with dramatic flourish, but through the slow suffocation of a kingdom drowning in its own moral decay. By Akhenaten's 17th year as pharaoh, the very foundations of Egyptian civilization were crumbling beneath the weight of his depravity. The god-king who had promised his people a new dawn of spiritual enlightenment had instead delivered them into a nightmare from which there seemed no awakening. The final daughter to suffer elevation to queenship was little Nefer-Neferu, a child so young that palace servants wept openly when they received orders to prepare her for the ceremony. This girl, whose name meant beautiful is the beauty of Ra, would discover that beauty held no protection against a father's twisted ambitions. The preparations for her transformation followed the same horrific pattern that had destroyed her sisters. But by now, the palace staff moved through these rituals with the mechanical precision of the damned. The psychological conditioning required to prepare such a young child for her fate pushed the boundaries of human cruelty beyond any previously imagined limits. Palace tutors, their faces hollow with the weight of what they were compelled to do, subjected Nefer-Neferu to months of intensive indoctrination designed to convince her that serving as her father's wife was the highest honor the gods could bestow. These sessions, conducted in chambers decorated with images of divine marriage, represented a systematic assault on the child's developing sense of self and morality. Medical records from this period, written in the careful euphemisms that palace physicians used to mask their revulsion, described treating a child whose body bore the unmistakable signs of preparation for adult relationships she was nowhere near ready to endure. These same documents hint at the use of drugs and other substances designed to make the transition easier, though the physician's obvious distress suggests that even these measures could not mask the fundamental horror of what was being perpetrated. The ceremonies marking Nefer-Neferu's elevation to queenship were conducted before an audience that had grown increasingly sparse, as even Akhenaten's most devoted followers found excuses to absent themselves from these spectacles. The few courtiers who remained moved through the rituals with faces like death masks, their participation compelled by terror of the consequences of refusal, but their souls clearly recoiling from what they witnessed. The artistic record from this final phase of Akhenaten's domestic reign captures imagery so disturbing that later generations would destroy most examples, rather than allow such depictions to survive. The reliefs showing Nefer-Neferu in her new role reveal a child whose spirit had been so thoroughly broken that she appeared more like a beautifully crafted doll than a living human being. Her eyes, once bright with childhood curiosity, had become empty windows that reflected nothing but the void where her personality had once resided. The physical toll of these arrangements on Akhenaten himself was becoming increasingly apparent to those around him. Contemporary accounts describe a man who had aged decades in the span of a few years, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with the fevered intensity of someone who had gazed too long into an abyss of his own making. Palace servants whispered that he had begun talking to invisible companions, carrying on conversations with gods who spoke only to him, and delivered commands that grew more bizarre with each passing day. The surviving princesses, who had not yet been subjected to their father's attention, lived in a state of psychological terror, so profound that it manifested in physical symptoms that baffled palace physicians. Setapenra, the youngest, had developed a condition that caused her to speak only in whispers, as if afraid that raising her voice might draw their father's notice. Palace records describe treating her for ailments that modern understanding would recognize as severe anxiety and depression, though ancient medicine could only address the symptoms without comprehending their psychological roots. The international situation had deteriorated to the point where Egypt faced the real possibility of military invasion from multiple directions. The Hittites had begun making serious incursions into Egyptian territory in Syria, while Nubian tribes tested the southern borders with increasing boldness. The vassal states that had once provided tribute and military support were either in open rebellion or maintaining such tenuous loyalty that their allegiance could not be counted upon in a crisis. When Akhenaten finally died in his 17th year of rule, the relief that swept through Egypt was palpable. His surviving daughters, broken and traumatized beyond repair, would spend their remaining days as living monuments to the price of absolute power unchecked by human decency. The systematic erasure of his name from every surface in Egypt was not merely political revenge, but a desperate attempt by civilization itself to forget the depths of depravity that one man's megalomania could reach. Today, as we uncover these buried truths, we're reminded that the greatest monsters in history often wore crowns and called their crimes divine will.